Good afternoon. We'll call this hearing to order. Today we're going to examine the general aviation industry, and in particular, just how the regulatory environment for small businesses in general aviation is inhibiting growth and in some cases threatening the solvency of small operations. General aviation is undoubtedly a small business issue. The Small Business Administration estimates that almost 95% of all businesses providing air transport services are small. The industry consists of about 223,000 aircraft in the U.S. carrying 166 million passengers to 5,000 public airports, many of which have no scheduled commercial service. And according to the National Air Transportation Association, more than two-thirds of these 25 million flight hours per year are for business purposes. In addition to the huge volume of its flights, the industry is a huge economic driver. And if you take into account both operations and manufacturing, general aviation employs about 1.2 million people and contributes approximately $150 billion to the overall GDP. In 2012 alone, general aviation manufacturers generated $4.8 billion in exports of domestically manufactured aircraft equipment. There's no question that the general aviation industry is a very significant part of the national economy. Despite the industry's contributions to the economy, general aviation is facing some economic challenges. In recent years, rising fuel costs, the decline in the number of pilots in the United States, coupled with the drop-off in airline production, has left the industry vulnerable. Given this, it is critical that the needs of small operators are understood by those who are regulating the industry, and unfortunately, this isn't the case. Many in the industry see the Federal Aviation Administration as out of touch, and the agency's inefficiency and arbitrary decision-making is a real problem for small operators. Whether it's delays in the medical or aircraft certification process, or it's the inability for the FAA to implement new technologies to enhance safety, or the inconsistencies in airworthiness standards from region to region, small general aviation businesses are negatively affected. We're fortunate enough today to have a group of small businesses in the general aviation industry, and I look forward to learning firsthand how the FAA's regulatory regime is affecting their operations. With that, I would definitely like to thank our distinguished group of panelists for being here and coming in today. And I'll now turn to Ranking Member Velasquez for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The U.S. economy is both vibrant and complex, resulting in an ecosystem of businesses, suppliers, and consumers crisscrossing the nation. For small businessmen and women, this may mean traveling at a moment's notice, sometimes to towns not served regularly by commercial airlines. As a result, general aviation and the flexibility it provides plays a key role in our nation's economy. In fact, general aviation directly generates more than $20 billion annually and has an overall economic impact of nearly $80 billion, employing nearly 500,000 workers. This contribution will no doubt grow as the economy continues to recover. Essential to this sector's success is ensuring the safety of its pilots, passengers, and those who live near airports. According to the National Transportation Safety Board, there were 1,471 general aviation accidents in 2012 with 432 fatalities. Conversely, U.S. commercial airline operations were fatally free. Pursuing policies that improve safety are necessary, but they must be data-driven and examined so that they do not create excessive burdens for the industry and the workers that they employ. With this goal in mind, the FAA is undertaking several non-regulatory efforts to reduce general aviation accidents fatalities by 10%. This strategy emphasizes training and outreach while focusing resources on the highest risk activities of general aviation. During today's hearing, I am particularly interested in learning whether these efforts are producing meaningful change within the industry. On the regulatory front, several issues before the FAA could affect safety. This includes a petition by industry groups to exempt pilots from the third-class medical certificate. While it appears that safety data is available for the FAA to make a decision, they have not responded, causing frustration to many of those in this room. In addition, aircraft certification remains a flashpoint for the agency. Not unlike other areas of government, the FAA has reported that it has a backlog of more than 1,000 certificate applications, which are required for repair stations, flight school, and charter operations. Of that backlog, over 130 have been waiting for more than 3 years. At least one has been delayed for more than 7 years. These delays prevent new businesses from opening and existing enterprises from expanding. All of these issues have one thing in common. They are largely dependent on the FAA's budget. For FY 2014, the FAA received $12.4 billion, $168 million less than the year before. And sequestration and budget politics have made aviation a hot potato, lurching from crisis to crisis. In April of last year, air traffic controller furloughs led to flight delays. Then, in October, 12,000 FAA employees were furloughed for 16 days. So if you are wondering why the FAA hasn't gotten back to you or has a large backlog, I think we all know the answer. The truth is that budget cuts, sequestration, and shutdowns affect all areas of government, and aviation is not an exception. However, with that said, we must try to do what we can to ensure the general aviation industry remains strong in light of these current fiscal challenges. It plays an important role in the U.S. economy, particularly for areas that lack other transportation infrastructure and is poised to grow stronger over the next 20 years. Through its presence, it is not only that creates jobs, but also serves as an economic anchor for many rural communities. I thank the panel of witnesses for traveling here today, and I look forward to their testimony. I yield back.
With that, we'll going to open it up to our witnesses. We do have a series of votes that are scheduled between 1:30 and 1:45. As it turns out, approximately 5 votes, which we will, I think we can get through our witnesses, and then we will break and then come back, if that's all right with everybody. Our first witness is John Usakai, who's the president and CEO of Aspen Avionics in Albuquerque, New Mexico. John has over 33 years of experience in the avionics industry, and he started out as an engineer at Boeing before moving into management positions at Sperry and Honeywell. Immediately prior to joining Aspen, John was the president and COO of Nordam Group, an aviation parts manufacturer and maintenance company. In January 2013, John was named Entrepreneur of the Year by the Living Legends of Aviation, and he holds a bachelor's degree in electrical and computer engineering from Oregon State University and an MBA from City University in Seattle, Washington. He's testifying on behalf of the General Aviation Manufacturers Association. Thanks for being here, Mr. Usakai.
Okay, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Velasquez and distinguished members of the committee, I really appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the impact of the FAA on small businesses. My name is John Usakai, as Congressman Graves says. I'm President and Chief Executive of Aspen Avionics in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I also serve on the Board of Directors of the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, and I'm also Chair of their Flight Operations Policy Committee. And I'm really honored to give this testimony on their behalf as well today. I'm also an instrument-rated pilot and owner of an aircraft. Aspen was founded in 2004 and was founded by 2 aviation enthusiasts from Albuquerque with the mission of designing and manufacturing low-cost avionics for primary flight displays and multifunction displays for the lower end of the industry. In 2008, we delivered our first product, which was a primary flight display, which was groundbreaking in the general aviation industry, as it brought technologies that up to now had been really reserved for the higher end of the aircraft, business jets and air transport aircraft. Our products bring electronic displays to the cockpit. Three-dimensional terrain awareness is a platform for next-gen display of next-gen and modification of next-gen data, and really provides a wide range of functionality. We have 47 employees, and our entrepreneurial spirit is really the key to our success. We've been able to do quite a bit in a very short period of time. We have now 6,000 aircraft installed throughout the world. 27% of our business is done internationally. But also the key to our success is really discipline in managing costs and delivering a return to our investors. Aspen is run by a group of venture capital investors who demand a return on their investment and require us to be able to be accountable to everything that we do. And so one of the biggest challenges we have in a small business is response times from the FAA. Each week we get delays that cause us to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars, and if you multiply that across the entire business of small aircraft or small aerospace businesses, you can imagine how big an impact it is. There are two things that affect us. One is the sequencing process, and the other is the actual process of certification. Sequencing a process is the FAA's method of determining priorities. Oftentimes, the expectations around when we get through that process is very inconsistent, and we have to plan buffers and plan in our financials the time it takes for us to get to the sequencing process. Once through the sequencing process, we then get into the FAA certification process, and in that process, there are many inconsistencies between certification offices throughout the country. There are inconsistencies between programs. There are changes in personnel that further exacerbate the problem, in that we have to make changes as we go along. So Aspen, from our standpoint, we raise private capital to invest in new products, and those uncertainties that we have in the process create a lot of unnecessary cost that we must absorb, and it creates a lot of unnecessary time, which in fact has a big impact on bringing safety technologies for the industry. And with that, as Chairman Graves mentioned, there are, in our world, we do retrofit aircraft, and there are 157,000 aircraft that are facing a January 1, 2020 next-gen milestone. And then while that may seem like a long time away, but the reality of the matter is that we must convince 157,000 individual owners of aircraft to upgrade their aircraft and convince them that it makes sense to do that. And the installation process alone is a long and arduous task. And when the certification process of new products takes as long as it does, it becomes a real problem for us. So from our standpoint, there are a lot of processes that go. The ODA process and technology of that is a good thing. Organizational design authority is a big process, but it's not cost effective for small business. We do not have the ability to do that. And from our standpoint, we need things like the Small Airplane Revitalization Act, recently passed by signed by President Obama. That process provides ability to segment markets and allows us to bring costs down, and we really push hard for that, for the thoroughness of that. The next thing is the Next Generation GA Fund, which has recently been launched by the FAA Reform and Modernization Act of 2012. That allows funds for people to finance the putting of equipment on their aircraft, and we think that's a very, very important part of it. So it is my opinion that the government should be doing everything to lift general aviation for the reasons that were discussed both by Congressman Graves and Congressman Velasquez. It's a very important sector of our economy, and I really thank you for the opportunity to talk about how our business interacts with regulators and the FAA. I want to be clear, though, in closing, that we appreciate the work of the FAA, their dedication and attention, and also believe there are opportunities to improve and reform their efforts to maximize their benefits and improve safety. I look forward to discussing this further and would be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next witness is Austin Heffernan, owner and manager of Royal Aircraft Services in Hagerstown, Maryland. Founded 8 years ago, Royal Aircraft Services is an FAA certified repair station specializing in aircraft painting, restoration, structural repair, and general maintenance activities. Royal paints military aircraft through subcontracts with Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, and Sikorsky, among others. And his company is also a prime aircraft painting contractor for NASA's Langley Research Center. Mr. Heffernan is a United States Army veteran with Meritorious Service Medal and received his bachelor's degree from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. He's testifying on behalf of the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. And welcome, Mr. Heffernan.
Thank you, Chairman Graves and members of the committee. Thank you very much for having this hearing today and for inviting me to present testimony. I'm Austin Heffernan, owner and general manager of Royal Aircraft Services, also a private pilot. Royal Aircraft Services is a highly regarded FAA certified repair station in Hagerstown, Maryland. Our staff of 14 employees provide structural repairs, painting, restoration, and maintenance for general aviation aircraft based throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. Today I'm also representing the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. I've been an AOPA member since 2002. My testimony today covers the following key points. Number one, general aviation is a heavily regulated industry. And number two, general aviation can't take advantage of the safety and operational benefits of new technology because regulations have not kept pace. And number three, FAA policies and internal structures are increasing the cost of general aviation flying without delivering added safety. General aviation directly supports thousands of small businesses, from flight schools and line operations to repair shops like Royal Aircraft Services. Thousands more use general aviation to move people and products, reach new markets, and support their customers. In fact, an estimated 65% of all general aviation flights are made for business and public services. The FAA oversees all aspects of general aviation, and over time, the agency's regulations have become increasingly complex and prescriptive. Today, we often find that regulations intended to protect pilots and the public instead limit or slow the adoption of new safety technologies and practices. Quite often in my business, we're unable to replace outdated 30-year-old technology in certificated aircraft, even when better, less expensive technology is readily available to the owners of experimental aircraft. The primary reason is that the certification hurdles are so high that manufacturers can't afford to seek the necessary FAA approvals. When a customer wants the benefits of a state-of-the-art engine and fuel management system, we often have to locate the unit in an area of the instrument panel that's out of the way or hard to reach, reducing its effectiveness. We must do this because we can't legally replace the outdated, inaccurate, quote-unquote primary instruments that were supplied with the aircraft decades ago. There are about 200,000 general aviation aircraft flying and just over 1,000 new aircraft being produced each year. These numbers mean that the biggest safety payoffs will come from upgrading older aircraft. Making it easier to upgrade aircraft will have another payoff as well, creating well-paying jobs for those who design, manufacture, and install this equipment. The FAA's approach to medical certification also negatively impacts small businesses like ours. We see many more pilots leaving general aviation than we see new pilots getting started. The restrictive medical bureaucracy within the FAA is one of the primary reasons. Almost 2 years ago, AOPA and the Experimental Aircraft Association filed a petition with the FAA that would reduce the hassle and cost of the medical certification process. Despite almost 16,000 overwhelmingly favorable comments on the petition, the FAA has not formally responded. This past December, Chairman Graves and fellow AOPA member Congressman Todd Rokita, both members of the House General Aviation Caucus, introduced the General Aviation Pilot Protection Act. The legislation goes a step beyond the AOPA EAA petition by allowing even more pilots in more types of aircraft to make non-commercial VFR flights without the need for an FAA medical certificate. Other areas of FAA oversight also impact small business. The current system requires the FAA to issue air agency certificates to many types of general aviation businesses, including charter and on-demand operations, some flight schools and training programs, and repair stations. The FAA has a backlog of more than 1,000 air agency certificate applications, a fact that is stopping small businesses like ours from opening or expanding. That's why I asked Congress to help small business owners like me by, number one, urging decision makers to consider changing the policies, guidance, and regulations in ways that will encourage and advance the use of modern technology in existing aircraft. And number two, urging decision makers to consider removing the internal issues that are preventing and delaying issuance of required FAA approvals. As a small business owner and pilot, I appreciate Congress's recent passage of the Small Aircraft Revitalization Act, directing the FAA to streamline aircraft certification. This will have a significant impact on deploying new and improved safety technologies to general aviation aircraft, and I look forward to Congress taking action on the General Aviation Pilot Protection Act. Aviation is American. It started here, and we need to maintain our leadership in this area. We need to find ways to encourage and grow this amazing industry and we appreciate your support. On behalf of the 14 employees of Royal Aircraft Services and the nearly 400,000 members of AOPA, I thank you for your leadership in addressing the concerns of the general aviation industry so that it can continue to help small businesses nationwide grow and thrive. Thank you again for the opportunity to present here today before this committee.
Thank you. Up next is Jamel Larkins. He's the president and CEO of Ascension Air in Atlanta, Georgia. An entrepreneur and pilot since the age of 14, Mr. Larkins has been responsible for overseeing the rapid growth of Ascension's private aircraft sales, leasing, financing, and management services since founding the company in 2004. He's been named the #1 entrepreneur under the age of 30 by Inc. magazine, was featured in Forbes magazine as a 30 under 30 energy and industry leader, and more recently has been named the Emerging Entrepreneur of the Year by Black Enterprise magazine. Mr. Larkins studied at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida, and is testifying today on behalf of the National Business Aviation Association. Thanks for being here, Mr. Larkins.
Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Velasquez, and the members of the committee, good afternoon. My name is Jamel Larkins, and I am a businessman from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm pleased to be here as a member of the National Business Aviation Association, and my company, Ascension Aircraft, has been an NBA member since 2008. This is the first time I've ever testified before Congress, and it's a privilege to be here. In 2008, I founded Ascension Aircraft, and today I serve as the company's CEO. Although my company is a regional leader in the sale of fractional ownership shares of Piston Aircraft, the business employs just 19 people, including myself. Over the years, I have found that one of the most effective ways to sell business aircraft is to use business aircraft. With a business airplane, I can seize opportunities as they arise. The airplane I use for business is a Cirrus SR-22, like the model one I have here before me. The airplane enables me to meet face-to-face with potential clients, and that level of service and accountability helps me get a leg up on my competition and also build my company. Of course, many of my clients are also small business owners and entrepreneurs. They're often located in out-of-way places, and like me, they recognize the benefits an airplane can provide. With a business airplane, an entrepreneur can travel for meetings to multiple cities in a single day, return to headquarters that same evening, and be back in the office the next day. With an airplane, a business person can transport tools or products that may be too large to fit into an airliner's overhead bin or too delicate to be checked into the airliner's cargo hold. With a business airplane, an entrepreneur can efficiently manage work sites that are distanced from each other and often located in towns with little or no airline service. Simply put, business aviation is a big asset for small businesses. It's the tool that makes business models work. If there's anything that I would like you to take away from my testimony, it's this two-part premise. On the one hand, the United States not only has the world's largest, safest, most diverse, and most efficient aviation system, it is also the best system in the world for allowing small companies like mine to succeed. On the other hand, there are a number of ways the FAA could strengthen its relationship with the small business community so that the agency's policies are more workable and effective for the agency and for businesses. When we think about the regulatory climate for business aviation today, we know that, largely for safety reasons, stringent policy requirements are appropriately placed upon the industry. That means it's critically important that the agency and the industry effectively collaborate. After all, when the FAA services go unmet or when the agency implements onerous policies, business aviation suffers. Here are two examples to illustrate my point. First, when we know that the FAA's policies require that small aviation businesses like training centers, flight schools, and on-demand charter operators be certified by the agency before they can open. Unfortunately, over the years, the certification backlog has swelled, and today, nearly 1,000 businesses are waiting for an approval, which could take up to 2 to 3 years. Small businesses like these are drivers of job creation, so we need to find ways for the FAA to streamline its approval processes for these companies. We want to work with the FAA to find those ways to do that. Now, I'll point to an example of an instance when effective collaboration has had a positive impact. It's on the operations side of the industry. As we know, many of the companies using aircraft are subject to a host of government requirements for installing equipment, like that are needed for reduced vertical separation minimums, or RVSM. Thanks to government industry collaboration, RVSM requirements were recently smoothed, even as important safety standards were protected. We would like to work with the FAA to find similar areas where authorization procedures can safely be made more workable for operators today. Equally important, we want to find areas where our relationship can be more effective and collaborative when it comes to future aviation planning. For example, as the FAA and industry stakeholders come together to debate the next reauthorization, I would like to reiterate General Aviation's community's longstanding guiding principles for FAA reauthorization. First, when it comes to paying for the use of the aviation system, the fuel tax works best for everyone in general aviation. As a small business owner, I know that we don't need any other funding mechanisms like user fees. We also don't need the giant federal bureaucracy required to collect them. Second, the general aviation community continues to believe that direct congressional oversight of the FAA funding system is necessary. And third, a continued strong federal funding commitment is necessary to maintain the strength of our national air transportation system. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Velasquez, I also appreciate the leadership that you provide and the bipartisan support that the committee extends to the small business community. I look forward to answering any questions you may have, and thank you.
Thank you, Member Velasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my great pleasure to introduce to the committee Professor Kenneth Button. He is a professor of public policy at George Mason University, where he is the director of the Center for Transportation Policy, Operations, and Logistics. He has published or has impressed some 80 books and over 400 academic papers in the field of transportation economics, aviation policy, and related subjects. Professor Button is the editor of numerous academic journals in the fields of aviation, aerospace policy, tourism, and transportation. Prior to coming to George Mason University in 1997, he served as a transportation expert for the OECD and taught at several universities throughout the world. Welcome.
Thank you, Ranking Member Velasquez. Thank you, Chairman Graves and the committee for inviting me to give some comments at this meeting. First of all, I want to emphasize the importance of general aviation for my own work. I did some studies in Virginia, and as the Ranking Member noted, it plays an important role in small communities for stimulating jobs directly and indirectly. So it's very, very important. I want to focus on a slightly different aspect of the question to the previous speakers. I'm interested in the demand for aviation services, general aviation services, rather than supply. There's an insightful article yesterday in the Wall Street Journal discussing the impending shortage, perhaps, of commercial pilots. Where do commercial pilots come from? They come from, by and large, general aviation. There's going to be a projected demand for future pilots, according to Boeing, of 500,000 extra pilots worldwide by the year 2032. In addition, a demand for something like nearly 600,000 technicians, many of which also start their careers through, in one way or another, general aviation. Most of this market's in China. China has no real general aviation market. It has it trains about 50 general aviation pilots a year. There's a huge market out there for the gentleman on my left to penetrate, to make money in the future. They need equipment. They have about 1,800 general aviation planes. They need personnel. To get into that market, not only is there a need for some trade restrictions to be changed, but also to ensure that the U.S. provides the appropriate hardware and the appropriate personnel, the pilots who go out into that market, the training of those pilots. Now, what's the FAA's role in this? Well, my perception is that most markets work pretty well on their own. But there's some imperfections which do need dealing with through the intervention of government agencies like the FAA. Security is an obvious one in aviation, and that's not, I think, on the table today. But there's also safety. General aviation is an industry which is not perceived by the general public to be perhaps quite as safe as driving a car down a road. Although, statistically, you're much safer, I suspect, flying an aircraft than you are driving a car down a road in '66, particularly this morning. Now, how can the FAA get involved in actually changing this perception and altering it? First of all, they need to be responsive, and they have gradually been responsive, to segmenting the market so that the regulations are appropriate for particular types of general aviation. It's not a homogeneous sector at all. It ranges at the one end from small aircraft with sails, sailcraft. At the other end, we now have a huge debate about unmanned general aviation, which I think will be very important for small businesses in the future on the manufacturing side, the operation side, and the usage side. That's clearly something being debated. We also have a situation where there's taxation, which I won't go into. I've expressed my views on that in the past. But what the FAA needs to do is to reassure the public. It's doing that, as I said, by segmenting markets, introducing new legislation, or being part of new legislation. What we do find with the FAA is some of the data is suspect. They do not collect as much data as they need to. They have not got the resources to do that, one suspects, as was pointed out earlier. But without having data and appropriate ways of analyzing that data, it's very difficult to come to firm conclusions about how well policies are going to work, or indeed which policies should be introduced in the first place. So I do think there's an issue at the FAA with data resources. They are improving, but it's still a voluntary scheme by and large, where pilots are asked to give information after they've made flights. Secondly, there is a speed about adoption approach issue. It does take time to get your licenses. It does take time to get certified. Perhaps dividing the industry up into rather more detailed segments will facilitate a much more rapid certification process. Because at the moment, there seems to be very much an issue of going for a higher standard. It may well be you might need to move down. Again, the FAA has been involved in this, but it has taken a long time to do. And I do have some sympathies for an agency which is rather stretched for resources. And I say that unusually for the FAA. I did once write an article describing it as the last bastion of Marxism, so I'm not exactly favourably disposed upon it for some other activities. But certainly as far as this is concerned, there does seem to be action. Not as fast as one would like, probably not always in the direction the manufacturers would like, but progress is being made, and one would hope that this progress will continue in the future.
With that, we will start questions, and I'm going to go to Mr. Collins first, and we'll just see what happens with votes. Play that by ear. Mr. Collins.
All right. Thank you, Chairman. In full disclosure, I am a pilot, and so I have a bias. I'm not IFR, but VFR. Because of some life insurance issues, currently I'm not flying because I'm not IFR. But, you know, I've noticed, I want to talk about the third-class medical requirement. Every 2 years, most of us are over 40, so every 2 years we have to get, and, you know, there's some fairly arbitrary things on blood pressure and various cardiovascular testing. And I'd like to, I guess, point out, you know, I'm a boater. In boating, you don't even need a license of any kind, let alone a medical certificate. So you're out in a boat and you got, you know, 6 or 8 people on the boat, and whatever's going on, you're not licensed. Driver's license, I know in New York they're good for 8 years, and you need a vision test, which isn't much of a test. I'm actually a Formula open-wheel race car licensed driver. No requirement whatsoever. So I can go around a track at whatever speed I want and no license. So here we are, General Aviation, Class 3 medical every 2 years, arbitrary requirements, and it's just, to me, government intrusion into somebody's personal hobby that, you know, we don't have, whether it's golf or tennis or race car driving. So I guess I'd just like your opinion. I'm a co-sponsor of the bill that would remove the requirement for a third-class medical for those who are strictly recreational, limited number of passengers and speed and altitude and the like. Whether you think you know, such a exemption would at all put the public in jeopardy in any way, or and I feel like any time the government steps in, it's probably just one more reason somebody may not take up a sport. Just your opinion on that, and your answer to the naysayers who say, oh my God, everyone's safety is going to be jeopardized if general aviation pilots aren't taking a medical. Jump in.
Okay, so as a pilot myself and over 40 myself, I share your concerns quite a bit. It does seem quite a bit, almost to the point of being ludicrous when you compare them to the other safety critical type of things that would do. I actually think this is a very important part of the future of aviation, because we have a shrinking pilot population, and for small businesses like Aspen and others, we need pilots to fly and buy our products, and more importantly, we need pilots that move up into the air transport category, the the data that was there. So, all of us in aviation view that as one of the biggest problems facing us in terms of the pilot population, and putting more requirements in front of people to stop them from flying is a real problem. Also, more importantly, many people start flying later in their life. I started flying just recently, primarily because there are other requirements in your life, whether they be your family or otherwise. And at that time of your life, when you can afford to fly, is the most difficult time for to do that. So I think you would find widespread, almost 100% support of trying to work the third-class medical for pilots.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Heffernan?
I think the third-class medical requirement is a definite detractor to business. As pilots age, and most of our general aviation pilots are getting up there now, this is just one more hurdle they have to face, and it really doesn't seem to create any additional safety. It seems ludicrous that a person has to have a third-class medical to get in a 2,500-pound Cessna 172, but they don't have to have any requirements to get in a 45,000-pound, 45-foot Zephyr motorhome and take it down the interstate. Does not make any sense. We're seeing more and more pilots leave general aviation as they get older because they have medical problems, and it may be just perceived problems too. Their friend, friend had some problems. They can envision themselves having that type of problem later on, and when they're in this point in life where they want to look at the cost of upgrading an engine or overhauling an engine or upgrading an interior, painting the aircraft, all these expenses or new avionics, how can you justify putting that much money into your hobby when an arbitrary decision at a third-class medical next year may take it all away from you? So why even do that? Go buy a boat.
You don't need a license.
Right.
Yeah. Mr. Larkins?
Personally, it's one of the issues that I don't immediately have to look forward to, but we actually have had some of our clients that are involved inside of our fractional program that have had to exit in the last couple of years because of medical issues. So it's one of those things that I think if we could come up with a solution that would allow people to continue to fly without having to go through some of those onerous policies that's currently implemented would be helpful for the industry long term. And if you look at some of the other segments out there, ultralights, LSA airplanes, people are being able to safely fly airplanes without having to go through that currently today.
Thank you. My time's expired, but real quick, Dr. Button.
I tend to take a cautious view on this. I think safety is to do with public perception and not actuarial calculations. The data actually the FAA has on amounts of flying is rather spartan and not particularly accurate, so making judgments about safety is difficult. As far as driving a motorhome or an aeroplane is concerned, one involves two-dimensional safety, one involves three-dimensional safety. So I think we'll have to be cautious. This is a perception issue of the public, and people are scared of planes dropping out the sky on top of them. I'd be perfectly happy for you to fly in the middle of the desert on an aircraft with no one underneath, but I'm worried about flying over urban areas. And with the success of general aviation building up business around airports, airfields, that may be a serious issue.
My time's expired. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Button, as NTSB's data suggests, the majority of general aviation accidents are due to pilot error and loss of control. Both regulatory actions, such as licensing requirements, and non-regulatory initiatives, such as increasing training and raising awareness, can play a part. In your opinion, what is the proper mix of these regulatory and non-regulatory approaches?
Thank you. It's clear that safety is a human factor, as they say in engineering, for many accidents. I think what's important is actually to ask the question, what are the main causes of accidents? It's not just human failure. There are different classifications, different types of aircraft, and so on, and to pinpoint exactly where these issues are. The Safety Board is very good at doing this. It does a detailed analysis, and one should act on that. But certainly one does get concerned when you look at situations where you have drug and alcohol abuse causing accidents. I myself was buzzed when I was a professor in England by a RAF student who had a conflict with his girlfriend. He had a pilot's license, took an aircraft from the local airport and buzzed the university. He took down some cables with his undercarriage. So the human factor is important. I'm not sure you can handle the mental side. He was an RAF guy. I mean, they go through pretty rigorous training. But nevertheless, the physical side is important. Have a heart attack in an aeroplane, you're coming down. Have a heart attack in a Winnebago, you drive to the side of the road. There's a difference.
Thank you. In your testimony, you point out that General Aviation uses about 16% of air traffic control services, but only contributes about 3% of the cost. Does this mean that the taxpayers and commercial airlines are subsidizing general aviation activities?
My personal view is that probably the gap is not as wide as that, because general aviation does not need some of the whistles and bells that goes with the air navigation system. They're rather basic. Nevertheless, I am a great believer in user charges. I think it is possible to isolate exactly what is used, not everything, but exactly for a large part of the cost, and those costs should be allocated appropriately.
Thank you. Mr. Larkins, roughly two-thirds of air traffic control system carrying costs are financed through aviation excise taxes of some sort, including tickets taxes, segment fees, international head taxes, and fuel taxes. If it is determined that additional funds are needed to continue to operate the air traffic control system, and budget cuts makes it impossible to use additional taxpayers' dollars, how would you suggest the FAA raise these funds?
Personally, I would say that I don't think anyone on the general aviation side would have an issue with continuing to pay through the fuel tax. Even if that needed to be adjusted to be able to pay more, we think that that's probably the most efficient use of it. Before I had the opportunity to get my first license here inside the United States, I actually had the opportunity to get my student pilot's license in Canada. And there are user fees that are currently being collected for aviation activities there. Personally, I can tell you from my own experience, going through Canada and having to pay for it there is not as efficient, is not as user-friendly as what it is here inside the United States. So from my experience, over 2,000 hours of flight time in all sorts of different aircraft and throughout a lot of parts of the world, I would definitely recommend that we continue to pay for our use of the system through fuel taxes versus any sort of user fees.
Dr. Button, would you care to comment on my question? How do you suggest?
I think user fees are are important. The point about user fees are they not just collect revenue, which is an interest clearly to government a lot of the time. They actually affect behaviour. And at the moment, there are situations where we have, and this is something no one's commented on, the increased number of hours required to qualify for a commercial license, gone up from 250 to 1,500 hours. It costs money to qualify as a commercial pilot. Basically, you get your license, you fly around in circles for 2 years, then you get a license, which is not very efficient. I think user fees may well be a better way of encouraging people to move in the industry. I think they may well be also tied in particular ways to the type of activity involved in those 1,500 miles. Simply flying in circles does not seem to me to be a particularly effective way of increasing safety. Takeoffs and landings seem a bit more dangerous to me. I don't know.
Okay.
So I tie things together.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think what we'll do is we'll take a quick recess, and then we'll come back and we'll continue with questions, and we'll get through this vote series. I apologize for the inconvenience of the vote, but it is what it is. We'll be in recess for until we're done. We can go ahead and get started, and then we'll wait on the other members to come back. Again, I apologize for the vote series, which is also always an issue in Congress. I'll start my questions with Mr. Button, which I always get, or Dr. Button, I apologize, which I always get frustrated when we make generalities to try to make a point. And, you know, that talking about third-class medicals and heart attacks, and when you have a heart attack in a Winnebago, you just pull off the side of the road, but when you're doing a plane, you come down on top, which I can make the same generality the other way. You have a heart attack in Winnebago, you're going to cross the line, you're going to kill somebody, but you have it in a plane, you just land it. So, it's very frustrating to me when we see that, and particularly when, and just to clarify for folks on third-class medicals, it's a 2-year process, so you're basically self-certifying anyway. Once you take that medical, you've got 2 years before you even have to mess with it. So I am very frustrated by that. But my question to you is, when you're talking about a data-driven process with the FAA, and we need more data to be able to regulate. But then you turn right back around and said that safety should be a public perception process rather than data-driven. Are you suggesting the FAA develop policy based on public perception?
First of all, my comment about the Winnebago was also a data problem, because the data, for example, the FAA has on flights by General Aviation and so on is poor. So working out the probability of having an accident with someone having a heart attack in a motor vehicle as opposed to an airplane is a tricky statistical one. No, I think the problem is that there's two things. First of all, I think policies are made on the basis of perception a lot of the time. I think that's because people perceive the benefits they enjoy from things, and there's an educational process required. And the educational process is very difficult to achieve without adequate data. That was really my point. Policy should be data-driven, but nevertheless, unless people are confident in the data, they will perceive things. And if you're a policymaker, my view is that you essentially adopt policies which people perceive to be good, and that's right through the whole policy agenda as far as I can tell.
So I take a much more objective position on policy. I think policy ought to be, based on that data and not based on emotional arguments which drive perception. And and in the case of aviation, that can be at its worst. Again, making generalities like you make when it comes to driving a point.
Well, let me drive the point a slightly different way. How many inches or how many column inches in newspapers are devoted to a single general aviation crash, and how many inches are devoted to a car crash? There's been studies done on this, and clearly rare incidents of, I don't like to use the term to be honest, but it's probably the only one I can think of, spectacular events tend to attract public attention. And public attention does drive policy. I'm not a politician, but certainly perception is important in the electoral process, and it's true in the policy process. I would like to have an objective-driven system, to be blunt with you, but it's simply not the way it works. It's not the way the media works, and it's often not the way individuals' minds work either. People are scared of flying still. It's the safest way of moving around the world, but they're still scared. And that is a problem. They don't normally know the statistics. They just hear about serious accidents.
Well, and that's unfortunate, too. And just to use your example of column inches devoted to car crash as opposed to an airplane crash, you're right, because there are so many car crashes. The sheer number of volume of the car accidents out there and people getting killed by somebody else crossing the line, and that's what's always worried to me. If I'm driving down a 2-lane road and I'm going 60 miles an hour and the person coming at me is going 60 miles an hour, that means we're closing at 120 miles an hour, and I hope like hell that he's going to stay on his side of the road. I have to depend on somebody else, whereas in the air, I don't. And so, it's very frustrating to me when we do use, again, these emotional generalities, and then we talk about whether or not we should be basing public policy on perception. My next question is actually for Mr. Heffernan and Mr. Yuzukai. In fact, if anybody else wants to weigh in, you're more than happy to. And we hear a lot of talk about the FAA and the backlog as a result of sequestration, budget cuts, whatever the case may be, which are fairly recent, to be quite honest with you. And my question to you, you all have been in business for a long time. Was it the same way? Was there backlogs before? Was the FAA, were you having trouble getting responses out of the FAA or getting them to move in a timely manner prior to sequestration than after sequestration?
My opinion is no. We were not having any additional problems prior to or after. I think there's been just a tendency to kind of be stuck in the mud there in terms of getting things done. I haven't seen that the budget cuts though have really done anything.
Okay, from our perspective, there certainly is a difference. I mean, I've been certifying avionics for well over 30 years now, and what I've seen evolve over time, and most recently in the last 6 to 8 months in sequestration and government shutdowns and things of that nature, is that the FAA rank and file don't. Their application of procedures and processes seems to vary a lot more than it did before, for I'm sure a plethora of reasons, from job security to the perception that they have to be as safe as possible because of the pressures that are on them. We see the lack of consistency between applications between individuals and the FAA has increased since the pressures on resources and such have occurred. So from our view, at least from a manufacturer's standpoint, we think it's going in the wrong direction, and we think there are a lot of things that can be done to improve that. Most notably is to simplify the process so that an individual, for whatever reason or whatever motivation, has the process and procedures supporting them, and they don't feel like there's any situation where they might be on a limb or something. They may take the most conservative position as well. Certainly resources at the FAA are a very, very big deal. There's no question about it. It plays into the sequencing. It plays into the way they work. It plays into where they are. We see change in personnel much more than we ever did in the past. People are changing roles, and therefore we get different interpretations. We feel very strongly that change has occurred, and we would like to work with ways to do that. There are many ways to do that, ranging from more delegation to the DER system, the designated engineering representative, which we have these people that are 35-year experienced people that have been certifying things for a long time, and it seems like delegation is less and less used. And so these kinds of things, I think, need to be addressed, and I think it's very critical for businesses that are small, because if you really think about it, we have fewer products, and if one product gets held up, the impact on a small business is disproportionate. A company can fail as a result of one product being held up, and we encourage everybody to work with the different Small Aircraft Revitalization Act to make things more simple, use more delegation, so that the pressure on resources that's current and very real could be alleviated.
Are you all hearing from the agencies you have to deal with, whether it's certification or flight standards? I mean, is anybody getting laid off in the FAA? Are they being released as a result of budget cuts? Do we have the same number of people just doing less work or more work? Are we making work for them? Are they making work for themselves?
We have not seen any kind of reduction in workforce. We've seen some people leave the FAA on a natural, nothing out of the usual. My sense is that there's just not enough specific procedures and processes for them to be able to follow, and therefore they interpret on their own. So we have not seen any reduction in resources in terms of layoffs. That's for sure.
Nor have we.
That's what I assumed. We keep hearing about not being able to do what they did before, but they have the same folks. I got a quick question, Mr. Heffernan, about FSDOs, and in your line of work, which is a little bit different. I was just curious, have you ever lost business because your local flight standards office was seen as too stringent, or your customers as too stringent, and yet you hear of other FSDOs, because there's so much variance between them, other FSDOs that are overlooking whatever it is that your particular FSDO is claiming as a problem? If you see where I'm going?
Yes, sir, I do. We've seen a great disparity between FSDOs. It's one of the things that really concerns us right now. We've had customers. One customer example has a Cessna 190, very old airplane. He'd been coming to us for annual inspections year after year. This year, we told him, you probably need to pack it up and take it out to Montana. If we have to do the annual inspection here on it, the guidelines have gotten so stringent on corrosion that we're going to be replacing every piece of hardware on your airplane if we do the annual here. So my advice is, unless you want to incur that kind of expense, take it elsewhere. We've seen quite a bit of conversation on the DC Pilot's website, some of the other pilot websites, about people saying, from now on they're going to be taking their airplanes to Pennsylvania or to another state for annual inspections because there's so much concentration right now on corrosion, and the definition of what is and what is not acceptable corrosion. We all know unacceptable corrosion. If you get into an airplane and there's structural damage, there's rivets coming loose, that kind of, yeah, that's definitely taboo. But how much surface rust is inappropriate on a screw head or a bolt? Does it really weaken it? How do you know unless you do non-destructive testing or destructive testing on the bolt? And things that were left up to an IA or to a repair station based on their 40, 50 years of experience doing maintenance on that make and model airplane, was up to them to be able to make a judgment call as to whether they can pass it or whether they can defer it till next year or whatever. Now that's not an opportunity. It's basically within RFIS, though, you replace it or you're in trouble. And I just had a customer with a Grumman had a $12,000 annual because we replaced every piece of hardware on there. And it's a lot of it was, I think, pretty subjective, but that's the guidelines we're operating under.
Mr. Hannett.
Thank you for being here. I'm a pilot, AOPA member for many years. I owned an airport. Now I own a mortgage to an airport, which incidentally is marginally better. And my feelings about this business, and I'm pretty familiar with it, is we've watched insurance go up, gas go up. We have watched licensing, certification, lessons go up to a point where, if it's true, and I believe all of you have confirmed this, that if we're going to have commercial pilots, we need a healthy GA business, right? Well, I submit to you that GA is really in big trouble because there is such a thing, and you notice as critical mass, as a point where an industry is fundamentally dying rather than growing, and I think that that's where GA has become. So I'd say to you, to the extent that the FAA's inability to go through this process more efficiently, and I've bought airplanes, I've waited years for certifications, is really killing the business. That it's not just all of you collectively and how you suffer day in and day out. You're part of an industry that's in big trouble, and the hobby that I love, and I know Sam and other people, members here do, is in danger of evaporating because you just can't sustain the infrastructure we need to sustain if there isn't some amount of GA. So to the extent that things like additional gas taxes, which everybody would prefer that over a user fee, particularly in this country where I can go into a dozen airports in a single day and go and come at my leisure. Whereas in Canada, it's much more problematic. I've flown in both places. I normally don't make this kind of statement, but I feel strongly about it, and I feel badly for the circumstances because it is unique in this country. It is an asset that's unique in the world to us, and it is a freedom that we have, that people enjoy. And I look forward to my little boy learning to fly. He already owns an airplane that I'm going to give him, in spite of your $12,000 annuals every year. I guess I'd ask you a question about it, and we could argue about user fees. You're an academic. I'm a realist. I don't mind paying more money, but I don't like user fees because they simply create as much of an expense as they pretend to collect money. And in this country particularly, the airport I own, the idea of me having to be there to collect a fee to send the FAA would be an utter and complete joke. Wouldn't happen. I'd have to leave a can in the end of the runway, and somebody have to drop $5 in it. But do you think there's any truth in what I'm saying? Do you think the whole industry's in trouble because of this? Cessna, you said there's 1,000 planes being made a year. Cessna, just a few years ago, was making 1,500, 1,600. you know, and you've seen consolidations with Beechcraft, and you've seen Columbia and your plane, the Cirrus, right? It's not in good shape. And by the FAA holding up the opportunity to move things more quickly, and frankly, for us to be so litigious that everything we do has to be, if a third of the cost of an airplane is bound up in extraneous insurance costs, I mean, you know, that's crazy too. So I'll just ask you to comment on my little talk.
Sorry. Oh,
thanks. Anyone?
I think the industry is in trouble. I think it's got a big future, though, as I said earlier, if it can think internationally and start selling its wares overseas, selling its pilot training skills, which it still does to some extent in this country. There's a market. The law situation, I think, is much more of a problem. The litigation and so on is much more of a problem than the FAA rules. We talk about a few licenses being held up, but the number of court cases, the way the aircraft were operated and used, they're influenced. I was talking to some people while you were doing your democratic duties of voting. That's serious problems. They're deterred from doing things. I think there's something else one has to remember, and I told this story earlier to someone. When my father was alive, he used to talk about people and himself when he was young wanting to be a train driver. My generation in Britain, okay, we don't have so much general aviation, a lot of people want to become pilots. These days, the younger generation want to play on computers, and it's exciting for them to play on computers. They're used to flying. The younger generation get inside of a regional jet, a small regional jet, they get bounced around a few times. They've got their kicks. So I think there's a cultural change that's taking place, which is often missed by people actually involved in it. I'm outside, so I tend to look at it. But I don't think the industry is dead. I think it's got a huge future if it can start thinking. I think it does think internationally, by the way. I don't want to.
Well, Cessna's building in China right now, right?
But half the Chinese general aviation planes, which was about 1,800, are actually built in China. They don't work very well. They've got very few pilots, very few training schools. They've got huge taxes on imports. That's one reason Cessna's there. There is the Anglo-Chinese aviation.
Well, you know, when I got my license, it cost me $1,000.
Yeah.
Right? I took 40 hours.
Yeah.
I was lousy at it, but I got by. Today, it's $5,000 minimum, and that doesn't begin to give you any of the steps you need to become what Sam is and others here.
May I pose a question, not acquiring the license? How much insurance did you need in those days compared to now?
You know, it's an incredible difference. My point is, and we apparently agree, that every step of this business has gotten more expensive, more difficult. And whether kids want to stay on their computers or not, we have fundamentally taken away the opportunity for young people to look at it as an affordable outlet for a pastime or a career.
I entirely agree, but also I think a career is the important thing you mentioned at the end, where we got pilots moving into commercial aviation. They're earning $20,000 a year. I don't know. It's very low. There's some imperfection in the commercial aviation market which is discouraging people from moving into that area. It may be pay, it may be conditions. That needs to be examined.
According to you, it's not supply and demand, though. With all due respect, there's a gap there.
There's a gap. The supply and demand, the market's not working perfectly. You start hearing stories of airlines now recruiting, regional airlines recruiting pilots who formerly they wouldn't have recruited. They got some blemish on their record, and they simply in the past would have stood back. Now they recruit them. There's a shortage there. There's a market failure up the chain, and this is what I was that's what I'm mainly interested in: the use of aviation in training, the sales overseas, and there's something not working well, and certainly changes are required. I think the trade agreements are important. I think the FAA needs, and I think it is moving in the right direction. It's the speed is the problem, so I think things need to be done, your perception is because you're inside. I think if you stand back and look at the global market, the U.S. has got some of the best planes in the world, the best training facilities in the world. There's huge developments in Asia, huge developments in South America. There's a huge opportunity out there which needs to be dealt with. And I think the main problem are trade barriers as opposed to domestic barriers. But having said that, and I said it earlier, you have to have a strong domestic industry, a strong domestic sector.
But if the creation is taking place here, and there are small manufacturers, I've bought a few planes from a wonderful company, Jim Richmond, Cub Crafters. You guys know them. he's been in business all his life. He loves it. I doubt if the guy's ever going to get rich, but he makes a marvelous, marvelous product. It took him 5 years to get a wing load change to go from 1,700 pounds to 21 or 2,000 pounds. I know because I waited for that. It's ridiculous. So those things that we can do on the margin, and I apologize for my time, Chairman, that we can do on the margin to change that dynamic and slow down what I think is an industry approaching critical mass, we should do at every opportunity. With that, I'll thank you for your indulgence.
Mr. Payne, I'm sorry I didn't see you over there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To all the panelists, thank you for your testimony today. General Aviation provides approximately 18,000 aviation-related and dependent jobs in New Jersey and contributes to at least $624 million to household incomes and an estimated $1.7 billion in annual economic benefits. So I certainly have an interest in preserving and protecting small business in this industry. However, as Dr. Burton's testimony mentioned, I believe our challenge is not only to consider the impact of regulation on small businesses, but also to consider the general public interest, particularly in the area of safety. So your testimonies have been helpful today, and I'm hopeful that we can balance support for the important work that you do with the safety of the people we represent. So I look forward to working with my colleagues on the committee on striking a balance. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thanks, Mr. Payne. Question for Mr. Larkins, and anyone else can answer too, but in your testimony, you briefly touched on the sleep apnea issue, which, sent reverberations throughout the aviation community. And we basically got 4 sectors of aviation out there. In the GA community, we've got corporate aviation. We've got those folks that use aviation for their businesses and need to use it, but it may not necessarily be their business. We've got hobbyists, and then we've got the airlines out there too. But my question to you is, when you have something that's just a out of nowhere ruling by the FAA, and we're going on about talking about resources, talking about finite amount of resources to be able to use when it comes to regulating aviation, and you go through the medical process, which we've talked about earlier, and you can't even ask an applicant about their heart attack history, but yet now they want to know about the circumference of your neck and how that relates to your body mass and the size of your head and whether or not you've got sleep apnea, which I haven't heard of anybody, and this may go back to a data issue, but I don't know of anybody that's crashed because they fell asleep. But the truth of the matter is, how does that affect you and your business when it comes to potential customers, clients, when you have these things that just come out of nowhere and people don't know what to expect?
It's an important issue, and it touches on what we talked about earlier in the oral testimony, that industry working with the FAA is extremely important. And we look at like RBSM certification as one example of that when the industry and the FAA meet together, we can come up with reasonable solutions that ensure safety, but at the same time allows the industry to continue to operate. When there's things that pop up out of nowhere, like the sleep apnea thing, and there's not enough opportunity for the industry to communicate on it initially, that's when a lot of issues start to come up. And without the FAA getting the opportunity to talk to some of the pilots and operators inside of the industry, then I think that we see some of these issues of overreactions in a lot of ways that may happen, and I'm very proud to see some of the potential legislation that's coming out that will prevent the FAA from getting the opportunity to implement some of those things without more interaction and feedback from the industry right now.
Anyone else? She's a guy.
Clearly, things that come out of the blue are probably the most damaging things to our industry, whether they be the sleep apnea or regulation changes that have no basis of either fact or experience, and that creates a very damaging environment for us to develop and create safety products. And I want to refer back to Mr. Payne's comments about safety. Aerospace is no different than any other industry in that we are striving to develop products and striving to put in processes and procedures for individuals to make flying more safe. and whether that be a sleep apnea issue or a health issue or a functional issue. But when the system itself does not allow for the proper due process, and once that due process is in, a method to efficiently implement change, this is technically what you get. You get people and statements made out of the blue, and then we spend as an industry valuable dollars and time countering that when we should be spending time on doing the things, creating better safety products, better safety processes so that we can improve both the reality and the perception of aviation. And it's very frustrating as a pilot and as a manufacturer that so much time and effort was spent on that particular subject instead of other subjects that are more relevant to safety.
Mr. Heffernan?
Yes, sir. And we've spoken here a bit about perception and perception driving things. And I think this is one of the areas where perception is driving people out of the aviation market, out of general aviation. As they get older, they see these things cropping up out of the blue. And they see their friends that lose their medicals for one reason or another, can't get them back. There are people that that could probably get their medicals back, but they've lost the interest or the will to continue to pursue it. And when they see things come out of the blue like this, it reinforces their decision to get out of aviation and just go buy a boat or whatever. I think you know, one of the things that's always bothered me about the medical is I don't know any pilots that have gone through all the training and all the sacrifice and everything it takes to become a pilot and to be certified that want to be unsafe. People want to be safe, and I think they'll self-police themselves, and I think the dollars would be much better spent doing training to help people assess if they're physically qualified to fly, if there are any warning signs they should be looking for. And that would be a much better approach, spending the dollars on that aspect rather than trying to legislate some off the wall, out of the blue condition. It's always amazed me that you read all the list of drugs that would prevent you from flying. You know, you look at things that people take for granted that you know we all know people that are taking these antidepressants. You can't fly and take antidepressants. So you know, are people really going to tell the truth during their medical exam that they're actually taking those, or are they just going to are they going to make the decision to fly and not take them? So we have a lot of depressed pilots flying around. That's not safe either. I just think there's an avenue here for people to police themselves, and I think education is the way to do it.
My only observation is looking at the data, what causes some of the data on the contributory factors. You do have drugs and alcohol being influential in a number of crashes. You do have intentional disregard being a factor. I take the point about self-policing. I think most people self-police when we drive or whatever we do. Most people are very, very sensible. My argument about perception is probably slightly different. I think people have got to perceive the system to be working. And at the moment, we don't know whether it's working very well. And if you present this sort of data to an individual where you do have drugs and alcohol involved in accidents, not a large number, but some accident, intentional disregard, I'm not quite sure what that is, to be blunt, suicidal tendency, I'm not sure. That is something which worries the general public. Now, I'm not sure, and I'd said the question is out about the Winnebago versus the aircraft, the general aviation aircraft. I'd like to just know more information, which doesn't seem to be available from the FAA. They do take decisions, as you rightly said, sir, and the panel have said, and it just suddenly appears. You just get something coming up from the FAA. I think that may be a flaw in the FAA in terms of its public relations, or it may be a flaw in its data sources. I don't know. But it is a problem. And you can't just suddenly have some arbitrary notion that someone may suddenly fall asleep. I mean, I find that rather strange.
You mentioned alcohol and drug abuse and accidents and being a fair number. Do you got any suggestions on policing that?
Well, you could with the alcohol have the sort of breathalyzer technique kit you have in a car Basically, you can't start a car unless you breathe into a piece of technology that tells the technology you're not subject to alcohol.
So,
I'm not sure that's too expensive either, actually. Drugs, I don't know about. I'm not sure what drugs they are, and I'm not an expert on drugs. But it doesn't seem to me to be too expensive, and for everyone's benefit to actually breathe into a breathalyzer on the plane and not be able to start it without being clean.
should we do that with cars, trucks?
I think we should.
Buses, boats?
I certainly do.
Yes. Chairman, do you mind if I ask a question?
Go ahead.
There's no one on the other side. So, I'll tell you what my experience with pilots is, and I know hundreds of them. I owned an airport. I watched them. They are a unique group of people, very much focused on what they do. But if there's any group that I've ever seen that can adjust what they do individually to their skill level, it's pilots. People who are not IFR current, they're the first ones to know, but they can still have a current capacity to do that, right? So what I see is older people know they may have, or whatever their situation is, they don't fly enough. And incidentally, average flies about 19, 20 hours a year. It's not nearly enough. We should encourage them to fly more to make it safer, therefore make it cheaper, not more expensive. But what I see is people only fly in good weather. They only fly in the afternoon and in the morning. How about you, Sam? Is that what your experience is?
Very much so.
People pretty much self-police. And it's pretty easy to fall under the radar if you want to. You don't need to get your annual. You don't need to get a biannual. You don't even need insurance. Frankly, and I think the more punitive we become, this industry is becoming the victim of the death of 1,000 cuts. Pick an area of it that isn't punitive. And yet it's, in this country, we're more free doing it than any place in the world. I just think we should encourage it and not be so inclined to tell people that they shouldn't want to kill themselves because they already know that. Thank you.
With that, I want to thank all of you for participating today, and I want to again apologize for the vote series. But the testimony has been very good. I think it's critical to the success of general aviation, to the entire industry, that the FAA does a much better job of working with stakeholders so they can better meet the needs of those that it regulates and boost the industry rather than dragging it down. You know, general aviation is a significant contributor to our economy, and you know, I think the FAA has to keep up with the advances in the industry to allow it to continue as a very dynamic force in our economy. But it's a very important issue to me, obviously, and I think it's an important issue to every community out there that depends on aviation, and that is just about every community out there, and so many businesses that depend on it. So with that, I would ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Without objection, that is so ordered. And with that, the hearing is adjourned. Again, I thank you all for coming.